If you've been doing grammar drills but you still don't feel fluent, it's not you, it's your method. Grammar practice can actually block your progress if you do it wrong. And so in this video, I'm going to show you how you can flip that so you can actually start learning grammar the correct way and start speaking Spanish naturally, not like a textbook. Soy Hamid, tengo 16 años y hablo 4 idiomas con fluidez. Me hice fluido en español en solo 120 horas de estudio. Y ahora ayudo a la gente a hablar español con fluidez más rápido.
Podré para mejorar mi español cuando no tengo mucho tiempo libre para estudiar español.
Let's just start by defining what grammar is. What is grammar? Okay, we hear this word, oh, when you're starting to learn a new language, you gotta learn the grammar. What does that even mean? Like, what is grammar? Because a lot of us just imagine that grammar is like this massive sort of thing where there's like charts and like these different drills and like memorization that has to occur for you to learn this like phenomenon. In reality, grammar is just one thing. It's logic, okay? What defines a language isn't necessarily the words that are being used, because words technically all just come from our history, our past. That's why there are certain words that are in Spanish and in English that basically come from the same roots, which is Latin. And so words are like the makeup of the language, right? But if you take the makeup off, it's still a different language, right? Like there's still like something that's fundamental that is different from English compared to Spanish. And that's where we talk about grammar. And that's the main part there is the logic, okay? All code might look the same, but the logic behind the code is different. That's why they're called programming languages, right? Because there's different logic there. And so you can ask, okay, what does logic mean? And you can obviously go down that rabbit hole. Logic is basically just answering the question why. It is providing the steps of reasoning in order to reach a conclusion, okay? You might have heard of like premises in an argument. That's where people come to like a logical conclusion through different facts. And the logic is what's sort of connecting these facts. You can also think about it like math, right? Math is essentially just that. You start off with x equals 5. Here's an equation. And then the way you solve the equation is just by using logic, right? And so, if the entirety of grammar is just logic, do you think that memorizing grammar charts is the best way to learn the logic? And so, language is logic, and logic can't be memorized. That's the issue, okay? Just like how in maths, if we have 3 plus 3 equals 18 divided by 3, right? Right now, if you're struggling with grammar, what's happening is, in the math equivalent, you speak English, so in this analogy, you know what this plus sign means, and you understand the logic of how it works. But you don't understand what this division thing is. You don't understand the division symbol, aka you don't understand Spanish logic. And so think about how someone would tackle understanding this. Would they memorize that 6 equals 18 divided by 3, or would they try to understand what this division symbol means? What does this mean, right? You can obviously see the obvious issue of memorizing this is that the next time you get another example of division, like 20 divided by 10, well then you're not going to understand how to solve that because you haven't understood the underlying logic behind why this is. That's why the question why is so important in terms of logic, in terms of language in general. And so just like the student who memorizes all the examples of a mathematical concept being used will get an F, the opposite of that is the A student who doesn't memorize the questions but rather understands the underlying fundamental mathematical concept, okay? And thus the A student doesn't need to memorize every single example. Because there's no difference between 18 divided by 3 and 20 divided by 10. It's all the same concept, so he doesn't need to memorize each individual example, right? And this is the same thing in Spanish. If you understand the logic, the grammar, then you don't need to memorize every single one of those phrases on those like big sheets of like, my name is this, what's your name? I like to do this, my hobbies are this. You don't have to memorize all those if you learn the underlying logic of the Spanish grammar. And that's exactly what natives do. Think about in English, right? You're a native English speaker. Did you ever memorize those phrases? Like, no, maybe for like small talk and stuff, but generally speaking, like there's always a new sentence that's being made. Like so in these videos, I utter some sentences that I've never uttered in my life before. And it's not like I've memorized those words. No, it's just I have the logic of English and I'm just using them with the makeup of English, aka the words, right? But the problem is most people just have the makeup, but they don't have the actual underlying fundamental concepts. And that's the issue of memorization. And so I like to tackle grammar, and the way I actually learned grammar is through this framework, which I like to call the 3 W's. The what, the where, and the why. Now, most people find grammar extremely hard and excruciating, and it's specifically because they don't follow this framework or, the concepts of this framework, right? You can obviously take the advice I give in these videos and put it into your own way of thinking, right? As long as you implement the advice, then I've achieved my goal here. And by the way, if you're just getting started, I highly recommend checking out the Speedy Spanish Roadmap, which is a free course I made to help you start learning Spanish with these frameworks. And it'll be the first link in the description. In any Spanish sentence, there are two parts: what the words are and where the words are placed. So this is like the makeup that I mentioned in the beginning. It's like how the language looks like, okay? The problem here is that most people memorize the what and the where, and this makes it not make sense, okay? It was same as the F student who memorizes 5 examples of division being used, right? It's like, it's memorization. If you think, for example, ¿Cómo estás? Me llamo, tengo 26 años, etc. Everyone knows the what and the where. But the reason why they struggle with grammar, and the reason why you're probably struggling with grammar, is because you don't understand the why, okay? You don't understand the logic of the language. And understanding the why is crucial because when you understand why certain things happen, then it makes more sense. And when it makes more sense, you remember it better. Because humans are logical creatures. We prefer logic. We prefer things making sense. If we had guy A and guy B, and both of them made the same claim, but one person just put a because after their claim and then gave a reason, that person would get more votes, or people would believe him even more, even though it's the exact same claim. Because humans want reasoning. Humans want a because, even if the because isn't even true, right? Like, even if the reasoning is fallacious or illogical, right? Even if it's not a correct reasoning, just because there's reasoning, just automatically makes people believe more. And obviously, the better the reasoning, the more complicit we are to believe it, right? That's why, for example, gravity is such an accepted fact. And so the problem with most grammar textbooks is firstly that they're written, which means you're not even practicing the skills that are used in a conversation, because most of us want to achieve conversational fluency. But primarily, it's because they don't teach the why. Most grammar textbooks just tell you what it is. And it's like, that's not how learning works. Like any good teacher, if you've ever had a good teacher in school, you probably notice a pattern that every single good teacher out there explains why. Like, you ask a teacher why, the teacher doesn't get mad at you and the teacher doesn't just give up. The teacher literally breaks it down and explains it, right? Like, I never, for example, the first time I heard that anything to the power of 0 equals 1, I never understood why. But then, because my math teacher was a good teacher, he literally went through it step by step, showing the logic. And then I was like, oh, of course it equals 1. You can see how understanding the why is so crucial, okay? Because it's much more advantageous to understand the rule and a concept rather than to memorize examples of that concept being used. And so when learning grammar, firstly, opt for audible sources, so courses, videos, etc., because then you're actually listening and speaking, and those are the 2 skills that are used in a conversation. But mainly, understand why certain things happen. Like, don't be afraid of the question why, because memorizing gives you the pieces, understanding gives you the system to build with those pieces. So a builder with a blueprint can design sturdy buildings over and over again, but a builder who just eyeballs it might get one right, like you might get lucky, but they'll struggle to repeat that same success. And so in this analogy, Spanish sentences are the buildings, and grammar, the logic, the why, is the blueprint. If you understand the why and you can teach it to other people, that's how you know you've actually learned the concept, by the way, then you'll know that you'll excel in that concept. And so in grammar, for example, there's literally like no regular verb in Spanish that I can't conjugate to any tense that I want with full confidence. And even with irregular verbs, I would have like probably like a 99% like accuracy rate. That's not to say I don't make mistakes. I do make mistakes. But the idea here is that the reason for that is because I've understood the concept of how we get there, right? Or for example, with cognates, right? You don't just memorize presentación, implementación, narración. You don't just memorize those. You learn an underlying concept that when you take off the Asian and put on acción, it turns into the Spanish version of the word. And that's how you can get every other example. And so if you have struggled with grammar or you are struggling with grammar, this is the reason why, okay? I started with Duolingo and all that. They were explaining ser and estar. They didn't even explain them as verbs. They explained it as es and está. And so you might be thinking like, oh, but it's not fun to ask the question why and dive into the logic of the language. Here's the thing. Another word for learning is just education. And education, by definition, isn't entertaining, okay? And the thing is, when you multitask, when you try to divert your attention and split it, you're spreading yourself thin. And so what happens is you just end up doing worse in both of the tasks, okay? If you're trying to have edutainment, where you're both trying to educate yourself and entertain yourself, you end up entertaining yourself less than if you just fully entertained yourself, and you'd end up educating yourself less than if you just educated yourself only. And so this graph shows way more than I could put into words. When you spread yourself thin across several different facets, several different tasks, you will end up doing worse in every one of those tasks compared to if you focus on each one directly. I like to give this example that we incur the cost of change. When you go in a straight path versus when you go in a zigzag, you're still going in the same direction, But the reason why this is slower is because you're incurring the cost of crossing the street, and that cost will slow you down. And so the same concept is applied when you try to do several things at once. You diverting your attention is the equivalent of you crossing the street and thus making it to the end point at a slower time. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed. Stay humble.